The second the Jeep's headlights had picked out the drab and familiar concrete walls of the observation post, Billy Kikoa had known that something was wrong. Slamming down hard on the vehicle's brakes, the young private immediately exited, taking cover behind the vehicle. Cautiously scanning the ground around him down the sights of his rifle. The bunker's door hung wide open, swinging listlessly as it caught in the evening breeze, a pool of dirty yellow light flooding down onto the outside ground, projected by the dim lighting from within. Even before the devastating enemy attack on the harbour, standing orders were that the door remained locked and secured at all times, regardless of what those posted to man the bunker were up to. Finally satisfying himself there was no one concealed within the surrounding darkness, Kikoa now began to inch forwards, his weapon up, trained directly into the centre of the approaching doorway. The two colleagues that he had driven up to supply with smokes and a couple of magazines were both still inside, as they should be, but neither would now have any use for the offerings he had bought them. Sam White was slumped forward against the structure's observation post, 3 gaping gunshot wounds in his back, still issuing forth dark columns of blood, down onto the concrete beneath his feet. Eddie Cargill lay on the bunker floor a few feet away, having died as a result of a deep stab wound to his chest, his eyes still wide open in shock at the manner in which his end had been delivered. For the next few minutes, the dead men's colleagues slowly surveyed and assessed the chaos he was standing amongst. Both bodies were still warm, having clearly only been killed minutes prior to his arrival. White's Garand was abandoned where he habitually left it, propped up in one corner, of no use to anyone. But the rifle belonging to Cargill was missing. The ration packs and water canteens that both men would have brought with them for the evening were also nowhere to be seen. All of the evidence suggested a lone attacker, desperate, in need of food and water, clearly feeling they required the need for additional weaponry to that which they had arrived with. Whoever they were, they had left the observation post radio intact, apparently leaving in a hurry, potentially disturbed by the sound of his approaching vehicle. A downed enemy airman, it had to be. A savage, unfeeling Jap pilot, one who had just murdered 2 of his friends, and was likely still not far away from here, potentially on his way to kill yet more US soldiers. Like most of Hawaii's surviving defenders, Kikoa had made sure to find himself a reason to go down to the harbour, to view the devastation there in person, once it was safe to do so. What he had seen when he arrived there had shocked and appalled him, destruction far worse than he could ever have envisaged. The smouldering hulks of the Cassin and the Downs, the 2 sister ships having died in each other's arms, lashed together at the point the enemy bombs had rained down upon them. The proud Nevada, still ablaze and beached off Hospital Point, having drawn the full fury of her attackers after making a futile yet glorious show of strength and resolve. The upturned hull of the Oklahoma, countless engineers scurrying across her keel, desperately cutting holes for air hoses to try and keep those trapped inside alive. And all around the wrecks, hundreds of floating corpses, their once immaculate white uniforms now dyed varying shades of pink and red by the blood that saturated the waters of the harbour. Even outside the base perimeter, there was no escaping the carnage. Barely a building in the surrounding neighbourhood having not been disfigured by stray ordnance or blast damage. The harsh truth being, the Navy's response to the attack had proven almost as deadly to the civilian population as the bombs of their enemies. The wild gunfire from the ship crews and shore gunners, sometimes tragically falling upon the very people they had intended to defend. And now, 2 more lives lost in a brutal and unwarranted attack by an opponent who should by now have surrendered to those he found himself stranded amongst. Trying to suppress the burning rage that risked utterly consuming him, the young infantryman laid out his 2 dead comrades alongside each other. Slowly and methodically, he covered them over with the contraband bedsheets they'd both brought along for what would be their final duty. Kikoa's radio message back down to the base was concise, almost matter-of-fact, intentionally lowering the handset as the voice on the other end had begun to order him to stand fast, to wait for reinforcements. If anyone was going to avenge his two fallen friends, it would be him, not some humorless military policeman or some other yahoo sent out from the base, looking to make a name for themselves. There would not be anyone else around at this hour. Even before the curfew that had been enforced in the wake of the attack, the locals had always given this particular area a wide berth at night time. Pocketing the ammo belonging to the dead soldiers, and in turn wishing them one final goodbye, Billy Huaka'I now ran from the bunker, ignorant to the protesting voice that continued to call out his name from the radio. Out, into the night. It had not rained for several days, and the ground just outside the bunker entrance had long been baked hard by the unforgiving sun. And yet, here and there, Huaka'I could still detect the faint signs that someone had recently blundered off, away from the structure. Rifle in one hand, flashlight gripped hard in the other, the young Hawaiian native sprinted along through the darkness, following a course of freshly disturbed grass and foliage. As the trail led him along in a weaving line, directly towards the nearest tree line, he began to feel a faint sense of satisfaction, realizing he had successfully assumed the mindset of his opponent. Alone, and with little to no prospect of rescue, the killer must know by now that his presence would have been detected by the island's defenders. Whatever his future intentions, be they a renewed effort to escape or to commit further attacks, he would need to find somewhere remote to rest up and prepare. Pausing for a second and switching off his flashlight, the private deliberately calmed his breathing, straining to hear any sounds issuing forth from the darkness, however faint. There, further ahead and deeper in the forest, faint sounds of foliage rustling and tree branches snapping. His enemy, trying desperately to increase the distance between himself and any pursuers. Increasing his pace, only using the flashlight for limited bursts of illumination, Huaka'I pursued, noting the density of the forest significantly increasing around him as he did so. It would take time for the soldiers, who would be flooding up into the hills from the barracks below, to make it to the observation post, and even longer to locate him in the woods. He'd been too busy agonizing whether or not to stop, to leave some sign of his passage for others when the attack came. A pair of bullets whistling past him, off into the night, barely missing his face by inches. Having arrived and departed well in advance of the two loud cracks that announced them. Throwing himself forwards as his instincts kicked in, he found himself flinching as more rounds materialized from nearby, embedding themselves in the meat of tree trunks, or disappearing off into the surrounding darkness. As silence once again descended, he was already then up on one knee, the barrel of his rifle probing eagerly for any sign of his attacker. With a roar, his assailant was upon him, delivering a hard and cutting blow with the sword, the outstretched stock of the American's rifle deflecting the attack by sheer luck, rather than any skill on the part of its owner. The force of the resultant impact knocked the weapon from his grasp, sending the Hawaiian sprawling backwards to the ground. But in a moment, he was back up again, swiftly unsheathing the bayonet from its scabbard, holding it high for his opponent to register. As he now beheld his attacker, Huaka'I's mouth fell open slightly in surprise. If the kid was any older than 18, it could only have been by a matter of days, rather than months. The grease-smothered black overalls and simple woolen hat he wore were also markedly different to any pilot's uniform of any nation. A sailor then, potentially having escaped from a stricken submarine, like the two-man vessel the army had found washed up on Honolulu beach. Regardless, as the US soldier looked into the kid's eyes, he beheld fear and rage directed back at him in equal measure. There would be no reasoning his way out of this. Having held the back foot for the duration of the encounter so far, Huaka'I now opted to take the initiative, slashing out with two controlled and probing thrusts, forcing his opponent backwards. The enemy soldier recovered quickly, striking back with practiced moves that took all the Hawaiian's resolve to parry and deflect. As the Japanese blade was swung towards him again, Huaka'I found himself surprised by its length, far shorter than the ones he had seen depicted in magazine articles and movies. Shrugging off the thought, he struck out again, managing to catch his enemy's right hand with his blade, forcing him to drop the sword. But his opponent was not to be beaten, aiming a kick that connected hard with his right leg, causing it to buckle, sending him crashing to the forest floor. Rising back up to his feet, he now found himself staring down the barrel of a pistol, brandished triumphantly at the centre of his torso. Discarding the bayonet at the direction of his captor, Kikoa closed his eyes, mentally preparing himself for what would likely be his end. But the silence of the night sky was suddenly broken by an unexpected and unnatural blaring sound that trumpeted forth from somewhere deeper off in the forest. Meeting the gaze of his captor, the American saw his own confusion now reflected back at him, both men struggling to understand just what the echoing noise they had heard had been. There was a sudden rustling sound from the bushes off to their side, with two dark figures unexpectedly emerging from the depths of the adjoining forest. Billy gasped as the horrifying and unnatural appearance of the newcomers was revealed by a moon that shone down from above. Both were dressed in the garb of a traditional Hawaiian warrior, wearing the shredded and torn remnants of blue Ikaika helmets and loincloths. Their exposed torsos were a patchwork of protruding bone and gaping wounds, inflicted many centuries ago, yet never having managed to fully heal. The face of one had been reduced to little more than a leering skull, with no flesh remaining. The other still had one functioning eye, which was by now a milky and opaque orb, mounted loosely in its socket. Although unable to see anything, the newcomers somehow began to walk confidently in the direction of the two men, their hands stretched outwards, as if searching for living prey. At that point there was a further trumpeting sound, from much closer this time, announcing the arrival of yet more of these sinister and undead warriors. A long column of similarly decaying and degraded figures shuffled into sight from behind the two that had already appeared. With a terrified scream, the Japanese submariner turned to meet the ghouls, firing off the remaining magazine of his pistol towards them as he did so. Several of his rounds found their mark, thumping noisily into the dead skin of the advancing figures, who did not seem to register the impacts at all. Almost instantaneously, the pace of their sightless march seemed to increase, its course now settling in the source of the attack, arms reaching out hungrily in search of their assailant. Kikoa watched in horror as the Japanese sailor hurriedly retrieved his sword from the floor, hacking and slashing away wildly as the approaching horrors closed in on him. His cries then began to intensify, becoming more panicked as the blade of the gun-toe suddenly held fast within the chest of the lead attacker. More of the undead were upon him now, lifting him up with cold and bony hands as he howled and tried to resist them. Kikoa watching on as their unseeing journey now commenced, carrying their unwilling prisoner along with them. The youth's eyes were fixed upon him, pleading for help, for him to do anything, even to open fire on him, if not to physically help him escape his fate. Then he was gone, along with the shuffling figures of those that were restraining him, the sounds of his screams disappearing as they descended deeper into the smothering depths of the surrounding forest. As Kikoa turned his head to look away from what had just taken place, half ashamed he had not acted to help in any way, his jaw now dropped open in horror. Walking at the centre of the column of warriors that continued to pass by was a taller pedestrian, bedecked in the tattered remains of a feathered cloak, wearing the bright plumage of a mahi-hole, framing his decaying features. The figure's head swiveled this way and that, as if searching for signs of life, before his unseeing eyes seemed to settle in the direction of the kneeling American private. Out of nowhere, the words of his grandmother suddenly erupted forth from the furthest depths of his memory, that if he were ever to encounter anything in the woods at night he did not understand, to look away. Several of the shuffling warriors had now split away from the rest, walking in his direction, arms raised in a horrifyingly familiar pose. Bowing his head down until it made contact with the harsh forest floor, and clasping his hands tightly together, Billy Kikoa began to pray. As cold and unfeeling hands took hold of his arms and shoulders, he lashed out, doing everything in his power to keep his head remaining bowed down, to show respect. As the arms continued to tug and haul away at his body in an effort to pull it upright, more hands taking hold of his head, trying to raise it up so it would meet their gaze, he lashed out, feeling his hands scratch and graze on the exposed bone of the attackers, throwing himself back down to the floor whenever he managed to free himself from their grasp, keeping his eyes closed more tightly than at any point in his life, offering prayers and thanks to God, to his ancestors, especially to his grandmother, all the time feeling the sightless and unflinching dead eyes of those who tugged and pulled at him, burning down into his soul. In an instant, as if at the flick of a switch, Huaka'I suddenly found himself suspended, half up off the ground, falling heavily as the arms that had gripped him inexplicably disappeared. He lay there, continuing to offer prayers for the next few minutes, convinced the ordeal could not be over, that were he to open his eyes, he would share the same horrific fate as had befallen his opponent. It took all his bravery and hope to open one eye, and then the other, to find he was now lying alone in the clearing, with no sign of the skeletal undead warriors who had been there with him. Rising slowly, switching the torch back on, the young private stood in wonder, staring around him, wondering if what had just taken place had all been a dream. And then he saw it, glinting and reflecting in the light of the torch, the Japanese sailor's sword, lying alongside Cargill's missing rifle, discarded on the ground. With trembling hands, Huaka'I cautiously retrieved the two items from the forest floor, turning them over in his hands, inspecting them for any evidence of the fate of their owners. As the whistles and calls of the soldiers who had reached the command post began to float through the night air, slowly penetrating the forest, he turned and began to walk away, back the way he had come, unsure of how he would relate what had taken place to his comrades, other than to explain how his homeland and the spirits of his ancestors had taken revenge on the invaders in a brutal and unfeeling manner.